Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session in this IFPMA Africa Regulatory Conference. And this is the fourth webinar of the series. And today we will have a very interesting lineup of speakers, followed by a moderated panel session and Q&A, focused on streamlining regulatory and ethics approval. The session will last until 3 p.m. European time, and we're very happy to welcome you as part of this conference. Before we get started, I'll just go through some quick housekeeping notes. So on my next slide, you can see that you have French interpretation available, even though the conference is held in English. To enable the interpretation, you just have to click on the Zoom icon that you see on the screen called interpretation. All participants will be muted, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask questions to the speakers. And you can also use the like tool to upvote some questions so that they go up on our list and we can ask those questions to our participants. All the sessions will be recorded and you'll be able to see the presentations and videos available on the IFPMA website, specifically in our page for the Africa Regulatory Conference. So you already have all the materials from the previous conference, from the previous sessions available. So we're more than welcome to do that. And I'll hand it over now to Janice Burnett from IFPMA, who will be our moderator for today's session. Thanks.
Thank you, Sergio. As he mentioned, my name is Janice Burnett. I'm Director of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at IFPMA, and I'm very happy to be able to moderate this final webinar in our Africa Regulatory Conference series. To begin the webinar today, we are going to have several presentations, and this is really to help set the context for the discussion of the moderated panel, which we'll be having towards the end of the webinar. And for that moderated panel session, we are going to have an audience Q&A component. So please do think about some questions that you might want to have prepared, and you can put them in the Q&A function below, as Sergio mentioned. So please do think about that as you're listening. And so what we would like to do is kick off today with an introductory presentation from Caxton Marira from the Science for Africa Foundation. And really, he's going to present on the research capacity activities and clinical trials that the foundation is conducting on the African continent. And I think this is really a good opportunity for us to set the scene, as mentioned earlier, and really see what good work is happening. So Caxton, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice, confirming you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. It's indeed a pleasure to join this conference today. My name, as mentioned, is Caxton Marira. I'm the program manager for the Clinical Research and Trials Community Program at Science for Africa. For those who may not know, Science for Africa Foundation, we are a public charity, not-for-profit organization based here in Kenya, but we work in the entire continent. And the program that I lead is focused on increasing investment in the continent. And I'd like just to paint a picture about what we've been doing and how it connects to today's topic. So next slide, please. So when I look at this slide, we've talked about this slide for quite some time now, and it's a really important slide for us because the numbers that you see on the left side represent really critical numbers for us in the African continent. And it represents the people for that matter, because when you talk about the 16% population being representative in the continent globally, and also the diversity and the stark disparity where there's only 4% of clinical trials happening in the continent, this means a lot for our people. The access to diagnostic vaccines, medications is not always guaranteed. And also for those that are available, and it's not really efficacious or effective because the participation is not guaranteed. And we've been looking at what are the challenges that make, for over the past 7 years, hinder effective engagement in this ecosystem. And because it's a large market, it's an $82 billion market as of 2023, and Africa only representing a very small amount of the clinical trial, that also has an effect on the economic elements. So if you talk about the mismatch in R&D pipeline on the right side, most of the R&D pipelines by industry and also globally do not represent the local burden of disease. The dual burden of disease also from an NCD perspective, non-communicable diseases also rising in the continent. From an equity and inclusion perspective, we have seen a lot of advocacy on this, especially from the WHO Global Action Plan. How can we represent more women, pregnant women, more adolescent, and also the elderly in clinical trials? And also we've seen that over the past years through our experience that the capacity is still fragmented from the perspective of it happening in the entire continent. And last but not least, of course, competition and also poor visibility of clinical trial site. The last one on unharmonized and time-consuming regulatory process has been a constant theme since 2017 when we started this process. And I think it's a critical discussion to have today. And I'll talk about our experiences. Next slide, please. So as the Science for Africa Foundation and also with our partners, we've been engaging in this space, as I mentioned, trying to answer specific questions regarding the clinical trial ecosystem. How do we enhance the visibility of the capacity? And also by highlighting the capacity, also highlight the gaps that can be strengthened. Secondly, the issue of trust, which is a very important one. How do we enhance trust and foster trust between researchers and regulators and sponsors? And we've been doing different things, and one of it being highlighting the data, because that's where the discussion starts. But also through building trust and highlighting visibility, how do we increase the investment from 4% to the next percent, and what that means for the continent? But also as we're building this investment or increasing investment, how do we sustain them so that the capacity that is built can be transitioned to speaking to other diseases that are not being focused. A lot of focus in infectious diseases. How can we transition that into other diseases? So the Clinical Trial Community Initiative, which we've worked together with the Gates Foundation, Novotech, who's represented here, and other partners, has focused on highlighting the numbers in terms of the landscape. And this painted a very good picture for us because this project has been with us for over 6 years now. And the numbers helped us understand what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and with who, because, once you understand the landscape is when you can engage from an implementation perspective. On my next slide, I'll talk about that. But also we've been engaging very closely with the industry through the Cross-Former Capacity Development Initiative. And we think the industry has a role to play in terms of building the capacity, but also jointly co-creating the solution. Because the industry being part of the major investors in clinical trials in the continent, then they also can play a part in terms of highlighting the solutions within the continent. The last initiative that we've been working on that I'd like to mention right now is the Clinical Trial Community Africa Network. And this is the network of networks of clinical trials in the continent. And the reason it's very important for us to mention about this initiative is because once we had the data, we realized that most clinical trial sites are coalesced around networks, and the networks have a lot of capabilities of playing a big role in terms of addressing some of the challenges that have been core within the ecosystem regarding clinical trials. Next slide, please. So in terms of the progress from our perspective and what we've realized, there is a lot of that has been done. There's a lot of capacity that exists in the continent. And, from clinical trial sites that we've mapped over 3,500, from regulators in the 55 countries in Africa. And just to highlight that the templates that were used to map these capacities were jointly developed with partners such as AVRF, Africa CDC, and other partners within the ecosystem, because we understood that having standardized templates is really important to paint a picture of the continent capacities. From a research ethics committee perspective, 196 of them have been mapped. And just to highlight as well that there's continuous discussions regarding how can we ensure that the visibility of this data builds in terms of highlighting the gaps as well. From the CityCan initiative, interestingly, once we started engaging, we did realize there's a lot of networks coalesced from a geographical perspective. Some of them coalesced from a disease perspective, and some of them from a regional perspective. For example, the EDCT networks of excellence that we work with really closely. And this helped us understand how they share some of the resources that they have, how they share, south-to-south collaboration and templates and tools, but also how they can fit into the narrative of addressing some of the challenges in the continent. We've also managed to map disease burden, where are the patients in the continent, and also for our last initiative at country level, also map from platforms such as on country platforms where we can get to know where the disease is located. And if you have this outlook of this data, then it's easy to locate where the disease is, where the capacity is from a clinical research perspective, and also how to engage with the PIs who are working in these clinical trial sites. One major element that we've focused on as well is partnerships. And I think partnerships is quite key for us to mention here because they play a big part in terms of how we drive our work. But having realized this, if you can click to the next one kindly, we have been planning how do we leverage this information to build the next frontier of our work and with partners that we work with. So we've shifted, or we are shifting from asking the question, what's your capacity, to how can we utilize what you're willing to lead on as a researcher in the continent? And also using the standardized tools and templates that we've come up with, from mapping clinical research capacity, from collecting disease burden and using the best standards, from regulatory and ethical requirements, and how to operationalize them, because we also had a chance to collect a lot of templates and SOPs that could promote standardization and harmonization within different regions, and centralizing this within a digital platform, which is the CTC platform. The other thing that we've been really thinking about and focusing on for the next couple of years is, with this information that shows the gaps, how can we now engage in capacity strengthening activities? And this is through how clinical trial sites are coalesced and how they are formed within the different regions. Are they within a clinical trial unit? Are they fragmented? What are the challenges that they have? And also looking at strengthening regulatory capacity elements, including ethics, which is something that came up as part of our engagements as of need to focus on, but also creating a critical mass of fellows and researchers who are coming in to fill in the gap, but also incentivizing them to stay within this ecosystem to build further what they focus on. Next slide, please. So for this slide, I'll take a few minutes because it's just a realization that we came up with once we engaged in this space, or once we've been engaging with this space with our partners. The capacity exists in the continent, and it's distributed within the continent beyond South Africa, Egypt, and countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Tanzania. There's a lot of capacity that exists within the continent. And as we enter into a new phase where we're looking at local manufacturing, vaccine development, and new technologies such as mRNA, and so on, why is it that we still have challenges to advance our agenda? And regulatory and ethics issues have been raised as one of the major bottlenecks. A lot has been done. We've seen evidence of collaboration and speed during outbreaks, but how can we institutionalize some of these best practices and ensure that we simplify approvals and also build functional governance? So in the next slide, we are quite happy to see the progress that has been achieved. I think right now it's 9 African countries, so that's an error on my slide. I forgot to add the recent Ethiopia addition to the WHO ML3 countries. This signifies a lot of progress made in terms of stability, well-functioning integrated regulatory systems in the continent. But having this means that a lot of more work needs to be done to ensure that moving from achieving the ML3, and we're also very happy with the reliance mechanism MOU that was also signed this year. But moving from the MOUs and the ML3 status to operationalizing practice, so that the duplication that exists or existed previously is no longer a challenge. So who's leading these discussions? Who is supporting these discussions, and also, incentivizing from a financial perspective? How can these best practices be streamlined and incentivized within the continent? Also to highlight ethics through our engagements within the Citizen initiative, and we have a survey ongoing that helps us understand how this is happening in the continent. This came up as an urgency in terms of ensuring that how do we ensure that the ethics committees are also supported as we look at the national level, capacity strengthening and also harmonization. How do we look at ethics committees? How they are funded, how they operate, and the challenges that they face. We have seen major governance issues coming up as feedback. How do we ensure that they standardize ethics and SOPs and templates that can support them to make the decisions in a timely fashion? And through our survey, we did receive feedback that at some point, concurrently getting approvals from an ethics and a national level may not be very well aligned. So how do we ensure that we are moving with the same speed and the same agility to ensure that harmonization is achieved at the end of the day? And there's a lot being done at a national level and also at a global, at a continental level in terms of aligning with, RF's joint review mechanisms, for example, and moving beyond this to, duplicate this across the continent. And we're also very happy to see the newly launched African Medicines Agency just recently here in Mombasa. This means a lot, but I think more needs to be done, and the partners in the room have quite a lot to do to ensure that happens. Next slide, please. So I'd like just to mention briefly, from our experience, we think that the clinical research networks can be accelerators of harmonization. And what I mean by that is, they can be central to unlocking norms and standards, especially when it comes to research ethics and also supporting regulatory harmonization. So if you think about joint trainings collaborated with some of the networks, some of these networks are regional, for example, the EDCP networks of excellence. And if you were to plan, for example, template harmonization, trainings, and so on and so forth, but also sharing of infrastructure in terms of digital elements, this can be an entry point. And we think this can leapfrog standardization across the continent, specifically for ethics, but also across the multiple, IRBs within the continent. And with new tools such as AI-driven diagnostics and also for sensitive research on maternal, neonatal, and genomic elements, these networks can play a big part. But there are specific bottlenecks that exist within the network space, which we've learned from our engagement. If you could click next, please. So funding for these networks sometimes may not be very sustainable. So if funding ends, some of the networks really collapse and we lose a lot of capacity, governance, weak network implementation plans, which is something that we did focus within our Citizen initiative, sometimes politics, and this has a way to affect how this is done. Ethics lagging behind regulation, I think I've talked about it. Even within the networks, because some of them are in different countries, duplicated reviews within the different countries and also sovereignty concerns, overriding reliance. We also did notice that there's a lot of networks that are being created and also in siloed, but also digital gaps within these networks that could be done better to ensure that they become accelerators of harmonization. So my next slide is the last one. Here, I'd like just to mention that we see this as an important element in terms of driving forward how change is done. And this can be achieved through change of the culture of how we do things. And because we are dealing with people, then we have to look at how do we make it required through policy and how do we incentivize, for example, if joint reviews are done the right way in a timely manner, how can we make it clear and also shared amongst the other peers? How can funders incentivize this? And how can we make communities of practice in a way that allows the norms to become more popular than, not being compliant in a way, but also providing the skills and the infrastructure that is needed to ensure that harmonization is achieved at the end of the day. So my last slide, on the next slide, please. is just to mention that for us to move ahead, let's look at investing in the trial networks that can be change makers within harmonization. And there's a lot that is being done within this, not only regulatory, but also on elements such as capacity training and capacity development and so on and so forth. How do we make reliance real, moving beyond the documents, but also using shared assessment, eliminating duplicated reviews, and also embracing technology. AI is one interesting one because we used it during our previous engagement, but it can be a useful tool to enhance reliance, harmonizing ethics, reducing friction because we need to build trust within this ecosystem, but also moving as an ecosystem and also aligning with existing infrastructure within the continent. So be it with Africa Medicines Agency, Africa CDC, AVRF, AUDA, NEPAD, and so on and so forth. So allow me just to stop here, but my main message is I think we can advance this through the existing structures, and there's a lot that needs to be done with all hands on deck in terms of improving regulatory and ethics within the continent. Over to you, Janice.
Thank you, Caxton. This has been really helpful to see that the time and the investment that's already happening in the continent, as well as I think what was really good from your vantage point was looking at the landscape, right? Following the numbers, looking at the mapping, seeing where we really need to move forward, and also look at what's being initiated, whether it's around the implementation of joint reviews, work sharing, use of digital technologies, those things that you mentioned at the end of your slide that we need to take forward. So thank you for that. I think one of the things that you mentioned as well, focusing on the topic of reliance, which has also been bandied about at the WHO Global Clinical Trial Forum in a meeting earlier in the year, is about the use of reliance in clinical trials. But I think it's something that's really not quite implemented yet, and something that we do need to focus on. So we have Lada Layens with us today to provide the rationale for how reliance can be leveraged to improve clinical research. Lada, over to you.
Thank you very much, Janice, for the very kind introduction. I'm very excited to be presenting to all of you the considerations on the use of reliance in clinical trial review, and specifically key factors influencing a collaborative trial assessment, as well as some considerations on how to put it in place. This is work that has been done across a collaborative group through IFPMA. So I have the honor to present it, but it's based on the work of many colleagues, and you're seeing one of them in the panel discussion. So thank you to everybody involved. If we go to the next slide, we're going to be looking at why reliance, why are we bringing this topic today here? So we see a transformation of clinical trials globally, especially in multi-regional trials and trial designs, and specifically as well with the rapid scientific progress that is shaping the landscape. So more trials that are multi-regional, as well as more innovation in our drugs and medicines and clinical trials. We also continue to see regulatory fragmentation. So we see country-specific regulatory requirements that cause delays, reduce attractiveness, and also can create frictions for clinical research globally. So what this group has done is has seen the benefits of applying regulatory reliance to the clinical trial review. And I'll be discussing later how to do it and where to focus. And here what we believe is that leveraging trusted national regulatory authority assessments, we can reduce duplication, speed approvals, and foster collaboration as well as harmonization. So therefore, we see a need to apply reliance principles that can enhance efficiency, safety, and harmonization in trial reviews. And these are principles that are already used in other regulatory spaces, such as marketing authorization applications. So we see a very big potential in bringing them into a clinical trial review space. If we go to the next slide. I hope you all have heard about regulatory reliance, but we wanted to bring back the definition. So this is the WHO definition in the space of marketing authorization applications, and we believe that it applies directly one-to-one in the space of clinical trial reviews. So it's the act whereby the regulatory authority in one jurisdiction takes into account and gives significant weight to assessment performed by another regulatory authority or trusted institution, or to any other authoritative information in reaching its own decision. We see the benefits of reliance in that adopting these reliant procedures, it could reduce redundant reviews as well as shorten approval timelines. And we've seen that in some of the examples, and enhance global research collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, it can also have a very big impact on multi-regional trials to speed up the review and increase efficiency and timely patient access to medicines. In the next slide, we'll focus on the scope of reliance. As I mentioned, I hope you're all very well aware on how we use reliance in other areas of drug regulation. And you may be thinking, but clinical trials are different. The review of clinical trials are different. They're more faster, and there are also local considerations to be taken into account. So to answer that question, we wanted to bring to you some of the key elements that we see in scope for reliance. So we believe that reliance can be applied to scientific rationale, the study design, risk-benefit assessments, IMP quality, to some part of ethics, and I will get into that later, and to data integrity in clinical trials. The majority of these topics are based on international standards and we believe can be applied across regions. Also very important to consider, for example, clinical trial protocols and IMP, so investigational medicine or product quality documents, use standard formats that already enable effective reliance in clinical trial reviews and that are being submitted globally. So that can really, really help in the application of reliance. And then I'm sure you're asking yourself the question, how can you apply this to the ethical review? We do think that in ethical review, we need to apply a selective reliance. There are still cultural and legal differences with local ethic committees that need to be considered and that need to maintain authority. But we as well think that there are some ethical components that can be globalized, for example, how we comply with the Declaration of Helsinki, and therefore we believe that it can also be selectively applied there. If we go to the next slide, we see different options to facilitate good quality regulatory decision and how we can apply reliance. You have from one side to the other of the scale, you can start with independent decisions where every health authority base the decision on their own review and inspections. You can leverage regulatory work. So either you do work sharing and you share across different health authorities, and we have some examples we'll share later, or you also have a bridge pathways for using reliance where some authorities use specifically the work of a specific authority. So there we see midway where we can still use some reliance perspectives. And then we also see the unilateral or mutual recognition, whereby based on agreements or treaties or equivalent relationships between agencies, either one agency unilaterally recognizes the other agency or there is mutual recognition in the assessment. And one key topic across all of this is the building of trust between the different health authorities that can increase the reliance and efficiency. And without trust, it's difficult to apply reliance. So very important that we start building towards that trusting relationship. If we go to the next slide. We've also thought about some key principles for effective reliance, and you have them in this slide. So it's really important that the reliance mechanisms prioritize patient safety and build trust, as I was mentioning earlier, through demonstrated reference agency competence and transparency. So patient safety is key. Also, as I was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, effective reliance can minimize duplication by using international standards. We have international data standards as well as other standards that can minimize duplication and enhance efficiency and consistency. It's also really important to realize that we still need to respect sovereignty and legal alignment, and therefore the mechanisms of reliance must respect this national sovereignty and align with the local legal frameworks for ethical and lawful operation. And therefore, there may be some considerations to be taken also on the legal frameworks nationally to see how to implement the reliance perspectives. It's also very important that we have clear communication and accountability in reliance mechanisms, and that therefore there is transparent communication of scope and documented scope of reliance to increase predictability and accountability in the reviews. In the next slide, we wanted to also bring to you, this is a slide that has been re-leveraged from a WHO presentation because we wanted to make sure that we bring home the message of reapplying the reliance practices that are already standard in the marketing authorization space. So this is a slide that shows the good reliance practices from the WHO, the high-level principles and considerations. You have the definition there as well that I provided at the beginning, and as well the link to the adopted WHO expert committee specifications. Really important, this aspect of international cooperation and trust building across the health authorities to ensure the safe, quality, and efficacy performance of IMPs for clinical trials as well as for marketed products, and also to make the best use of available resources and expertise to apply reliance in practice. In the next slide, we'll be looking at how to apply it in practice, so some implementation considerations. It is really important to promote the convergence with international standards like ICH, for example, E6 or E8 for clinical trials that describe the design and good clinical practice for clinical trials, are as well to WHO guidelines for regulatory harmonization. These form the basis for reliance, and authorities that apply these international standards can very well rely among each other. Also, the establishment of, for example, Memorandum of Understandings or MRAs to secure and formalize the information sharing among regulatory authorities is key. And we've seen more and more of these MOUs being signed between authorities. One opportunity is as well the creation of centralized assessment platforms, and I think we'll hear some examples later today. So developing secure digital platforms to share regulatory assessments and facilitate collaboration across agencies, for example, by sharing their assessment reports or other aspects of the decision. And then, of course, very important training and capacity building. You can imagine that by applying reliance and seeing the assessment report from other agencies, it can really help to develop the knowledge and upskill different regulatory agencies. So it's really important to invest in this training for NRAs, ethics committees, and trial staff that also will then enable to apply the reliance principles. If you go to the next slide. Applying reliance can be seen as change management as well if you're bringing it into a new health authority or a new country. So important that we apply potentially pilot testing for reliance models, where it can help identify the challenges and refine the implementation processes for a successful full implementation of reliance. Also important, as I mentioned earlier, to engage stakeholders so that national competent authorities, health authorities, sponsors, and patient groups get together to discuss reliance mechanism, promoting transparency and collaboration. And last but not least, very important to embed quality assurance and monitoring principles to evaluate how reliance is being applied. In the next slide. We wanted to provide some examples. Reliance is already being applied in clinical trials and quite successfully so, bringing positive impact and efficiency as well as learning to the clinical trial regulatory ecosystem. So, as I mentioned earlier, very important to realize it's already applied widely in the marketing authorization space. And if we think about clinical trials, we have different levels of application. So, for example, the UK MHRA has launched a clinical trial reliance pathway whereby if a trusted authority has already approved the trial, your trial can be approved in the UK within 2 weeks of submission. Other agencies that have formal reliance processes, you see them listed here: Mexico, Tunisia, Taiwan, Brazil, or Philippines. But there are also agencies that apply it informally. For example, I was employed at an agency where we use reliance in clinical trials because we simply did not have all of the resources to review every trial in depth. So one of the considerations was if a trusted health authority has already reviewed the quality and safety aspects of the trial that are universally applicable, then we don't need to look at that and we can focus on what is nationally relevant for the trial that may not have been reviewed by that health authority. Also important to mention examples of work sharing. I wanted to make sure that I bring ABAREF as well as the EU clinical trial regulation, where it's that middle case from what I presented to you earlier on health authorities sharing the workload, so relying on components of review from other health authorities. So there are already some good examples, and I invite everybody working in an agency or ethics committee looking at this to also learn from the successful experiences from other colleagues, and then considering what are the national aspects that need to be taken into account for application in your country. If you go to the next slide. We do recognize that for ethics committee review, as I mentioned earlier, there is selective reliance to be applied. So it's really important to consider the local review So ensuring that the informed consent and data protection, as well as other aspects, reflect the cultural and legal context accurately. So local review in ethics committees is still very important. There are other aspects of reliance that can be applied to the ethics review. So, for example, global consistent ethical principles, while still respecting the local authority for specific evaluations. And that's, we believe, a conversation that we could still have with different ethics committees on what aspect of the ethic dossier can be considered globally to apply to global ethical principles and which one needs to be considered nationally. And then, as we mentioned earlier, it's extremely important to balance the protection and sovereignty. So balancing participant protection with respect for national sovereignty is absolutely essential for ethical research practices. If you go to the next slide. So some concluding words, and I see that I'm ahead of time. Hopefully that gets good time for the panel discussion. So why do we believe that reliance is important, and why have we created this reliance practice principle document that you will see in the last slide? We do believe that we can streamline research processes, that we can harmonize globally, that we can increase efficiency and therefore use reliance and converging review processes that can speed approvals and reduce costs in clinical research globally. We believe that these practices can improve multinational recruitment timelines and enhance patient access to innovative therapies worldwide. Also, we believe that reliance fosters collaboration among regulators and ethics committees, ensuring an efficient and ethical clinical trial ecosystem. And we believe that these approaches uphold high safety and quality standards and ensure the best patient care worldwide. In the next slide, here you have on the right-hand side how the paper looks like. That's very similar to what I've presented to you today, and the QR code that I invite you to scan to be able to access the document. And we remain available to share case studies, to share experiences that we've had with different reliance practices in the clinical trial space, as I've shared before, the experiences, and we really look forward to implementation of these considerations. Thank you, Janice, and back to you.
Thank you, Lada. I really like how these presentations are building upon each other and how you actually laid out the different ways, and we actually can be looking at how reliance can be implemented in clinical trials review processes along with ethics. So I think that's a really good opportunity and is building off of what Caxton mentioned in his presentation as well. So we do have a few minutes, and so hopefully Adrian and Marina, you will not feel rushed. We'd like to invite Adrian Kruger and Marina Lazaridis from the Nuvotech Foundation to talk to us about a case study, actually, that's being run around clinical trials approval. And you may recall that Caxton also mentioned in his Science for Africa Foundation presentation that digital technologies and their use are really important. So Adrian, Marina, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Janice. Thank you so much for having us. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. It's great to follow Caxton, who represents SFA that we've been working with for many years, and also a lot of the whole presentation on reliance really fits in well with what we're going to show you today. So I'm joined with my colleague Marina Lazaridis, and we're going to sort of split up in the presentation to tell you a little bit about what we do. But you can go to the next slide, and just to let you guys know what we do as the Nuvotech Foundation. We specialize in the digitalization of a lot of aspects of clinical research in emerging markets, and specifically the work that we do with donor funding. And we have seen over the past many years that quite often these platforms, after we've completed a project, if there's no safe haven for the platform itself or for the initiative, and there's no real focus on financial self-sustainability, quite often, unfortunately, these platforms do not survive. So we established the Nuvotech Foundation about 2 years ago, really to become the safe haven for these types of platforms. All of the IP that we create is totally open source and is freely available to other entities to use. And we actively work on providing and building a financial self-sustainability model so that we can keep these platforms running in the long run. On the next slide, we're going to jump into sort of what the case study is about today. And we're going to tell you about one of the things that we've been working on over the past 2 years about with a couple of our partners, which is called the SAHPRA Engagement Portal. So SAHPRA being the South African Medicines Regulator. And there's a number of different aspects within the portal that we have done and we are planning to do. But specifically today, we'll talk about the clinical trials application module. So on the next slide is a sort of a very high level overview of the project itself. It's been funded by a number of different funders, majority of it being from the GIZ. And the first phase of the entire roadmap or the portal was to build it in such a way that it meets the regulatory guidelines that we need to follow within the clinical research landscape. So we follow the FDA's CFR 11 guidelines and also the EU's Annex 11 guidelines. And the initial part of it was to focus on health product application. So there we have a direct integration with one of the best known ECTD platforms. And this project has, the platform has been live for a number of months now. We have almost 5,000 active monthly users, 745 organizations that have registered on the platform. And then the second module there was the compassionate use application, medicine application process, and now more recently, the clinical trial application process. And as part of the ambition for phase 2 and the future phases, SAHPRA is really, they want to become maturity level 4, which I think is a fantastic ambition to have. And I think they are well on their way. And as you can see there, we have a lot of other things also planned in this overall roadmap. But yeah, I'm going to sort of give it over to Marina now. She'll take you through the clinical trial applications module. On the next slide, you'll see a bit of an intro. And I think an important thing to remember is that all of these things are open source. The IP is housed within the foundation. And it's also, we built it in such a way that it can be repurposed. A lot of these components can be repurposed for other workflow processes. And it can also be made available to other agencies with no license fees involved. Over to you, Marina.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everybody. So as Adrian said, I'll jump straight into it. I'll be taking you through the clinical trial applications module. If you wouldn't mind just moving to the next slide. Okay, so this is a pre-recorded video of the applicant view. So you'll see the applicant will log into the platform using their unique username and password. They'll be presented with the various types of applications. But for today, we're going to focus specifically on the CTF1 application, which is for new clinical trials. So you see the system is now running through the various sections of the CTF1 form. So as far as possible, we've tried to categorize the data to avoid capturing free text. So you'll see there's a lot of drop-down menus, radio buttons throughout the application. But we're just going to go through the section A, where we're capturing some dummy information on the application, and then moving on to capturing the regional monitors data. So this is now just to complete section A. You'll see there we have the geo mapping for locations, and then capturing some information regarding the contact persons. So we won't go through each and every section, but as we move to section B, I just want to indicate, you might notice there's quite a bit of similarity between the CTF1 form and the AVREF templates. So they are actually quite similar. Here you'll see the site details being captured. So what we're trying to do at the moment is we are trying to build a repository for each and every applicant where they can load all their predefined site details along with the capacity information for that site. And the same then applies for all of their trialists or their site staff. So they can load the individual trial staff, be it the pharmacist, the nurse, the investigator, as well as all the supporting documentation. And that will remain within the repository of the platform so that when they apply using the same site details or the same site staff, they can then just call on the information that they've already captured for those specific sites or site staff. So here we're just running through the end of section B. You'll see the video will then jump to the second last section, which is the ethical and administrative concerns regarding the application. But whilst we're doing that, I just want to give you an idea of where we are with the platform at the moment. So towards the end of October, we actually opened up the platform for user acceptance testing. So we invited a group of industry members to run through the platform and submit a dummy application and provide their feedback. So we got some very valuable comments, things like being able to upload snippets. For example, when you're trying to explain your trial design, it was very important to be able to take snapshots or snippets out of the protocol and upload them into the system. So we did allow for that. Formatting, for example, in all of these text areas, just to make it easier for the reviewers to work through that information and then link it up with the supporting documentation. So we are in the process of making all of those changes. We should finish up with that towards the first or second week of December. And from there, we will then continue with all the other application forms. So your amendments, progress reports, safety reporting, and any other study notifications. Right, so here we're just finishing up on the second last section. You'll see once the applicant then reaches the end of the application, they will then submit their application, and that will then, the status of that application will update, as well as the applicant dashboard. So they can easily see when their applications are still in draft or have been submitted. And then any further communication, they will also receive notifications via the platform. Okay, so just whilst that is finishing up, so there are some additional things or features that we haven't highlighted in this particular video, and those are specifically linked to the reviewers module as well as the meetings module. So as a coordinator, you can start scheduling committee meetings and you can assign applications to specific meetings. So I'm just going to wait for this one to submit. Okay, we're almost done. And then you can just move to the next slide, please. And just one more. All right, so as a coordinator, you can now start assigning specific reviewers to an application. So we do have an entire workflow management module. So you can create specific review stages, as you can see there, admin screening, a statistical review, whatever the case might be. And you can link specific reviewers to those different sections. You can then move to the next slide. There is also an option to invite external reviewers. So if there is a need for a specific subject matter expert, you can invite an external reviewer and they will then be assigned to only one single application. And once your reviewers are then assigned, they will receive a conflict of interest declaration. So they need to confirm that there are no conflicts before they can proceed to perform their review. So if you can just move to the next slide, please. On the next slide, you'll get an idea of what the reviewers module looks like. So it is a typical side-by-side review. So you have your application sections here on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have the reviewers template. So the reviewer will work through the application and raise his or her comments here on the right-hand side, as well as verify that the documents that have been uploaded are in fact the correct documents. You may move to the next slide. So once the reviews have been completed, we have the coordinator scheduling the committee meeting where all of those comments will be discussed. So in this process, the actual meeting information is captured, the meeting is scheduled, all of the assigned reviewers are notified of the meeting, and then you may proceed to the next slide. You can actually start assigning all of the applications or adding additional applications to that meeting agenda. So this is just the process of linking those applications. At that point, the reviewers will be notified. And on the next slide, you'll see what the proposed agenda will look like. So all of your participants, as well as all the different application types that will be reviewed during that committee meeting. So as the coordinator, once the meeting is initiated, the coordinator can then start capturing comments All the reviewers' comments will also be visible during that time. So those comments are all discussed and refined. And then on the next slide, you'll see what that final decision will look like. So you'll see the full application history there on the left-hand side, together with all of the comments. We've got an audit trail of who said what, any changes that were made, and then the final decision is issued to the applicant. Right, and that's the end of the CTA module. I'll hand back to Adrian. I think you might still be on mute, sorry.
Sorry. Yes, thanks, Marina. Before I go to the last section, which to show you something that we're busy with at the moment, I think it's important to note, I heard obviously from the previous speakers about the importance not only just of reliance, but also of building like a connected ecosystem. So these platforms are built with integration in mind. So it allows for sending data like review reports or how specific applications were handled by different NRAs. And it can be shared with other platforms from a reliance perspective. And I know AVREF is busy with an exciting initiative on that front. And then also between research ethics committees and the NRA. So it allows for two-way communication from an integration perspective, obviously everything very secure. And then we know within the African continent, data privacy, as it is globally, is an important thing to consider. So because this platform is built here in Africa, it's also hosted in Africa and can be deployed to a local geography if that is of importance. So it's just something because I know often we've been asked that question, and in the past we couldn't always move the hosting location, but now because it is a platform within the Nivatech Foundation, we can deploy it to a local hosting location. So the last section of the presentation today is actually comes from another initiative. So the Clinical Trials Application module is funded by the Gates Foundation, as is the base model that I'm going to show you now. But it was we built this model as an AI assisted model specifically to help process dossiers within African countries that is causing a massive backlog, and these are specific for generic drugs. And there we also make use of a reliance component, and it goes through the entire dossier, and it does a risk-based analysis of the dossier, and then that assists the review team to understand where they should focus. But this specific model we repurposed on our side. We're busy playing around with a potential initiative that can be very helpful. So you can maybe go to the next slide, and I can just talk them through it. You can one more click and the video will play. But basically the model, it is also hosted locally. It is an LLM that we deployed locally. It doesn't have internet access, and it is within a private cloud environment. So none of the data leaves the data center of the regulator. And then this is an example of how we can, for either the applicant, where Marina showed you now what the applicant's view looks like, or for the review team sitting within the regulator, we can make this AI assistant available to them. So once your application is fully completed, we can actually run this check for the applicant, and he or she can then see where they potentially might receive feedback from the NRA, and they can address those, saving a lot of time before submitting it to the NRA itself. Another way of deploying this model is actually as an assistant for the review team sitting within the NRA. And these things check not necessarily the scientific matters, because there you need an expert and there will always be a human in the loop. But this model looks at specific documents, whether it be the GCP certificate of the doctor, or whether the import permit has expired, or it'll actually go into those PDF documents, look for those dates, and it'll just make the screening of the entire process a lot easier. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to reduce the turnaround time within Africa when it comes to regulatory applications, review and approvals. So this is something that we're still playing around with. In the new year, we'll definitely present this to the wider community of how this could look. But yeah, we just wanted to share it with the audience today around some of the things that we are busy with. So that is my last slide. You can go to the next slide and then I'll hand it back to you, Janice. Thanks.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks, Adrian. Really appreciate it. I think it's just fascinating to watch what's being done. And also it'll be interesting to look at this over time. I believe this has been recently uploaded with SAPRA, so to see over time what the statistics are, the usability and implementation will be very important. And Adrian, just wanted to point you to a question in the Q&A, looking at how this module may be used for both ethics and NRA review. If you'd like to either answer that now or perhaps write an answer to that question, that would be very helpful.
Happy, I can do a quick answer.
Sure.
So thanks for the question. So the application form that you saw there that Marina showed, those we built an actual form builder tool that we use to build that application form. So it's very, very easy to build a different template. And because we understand how ethics committees work, we've been involved in building solutions for ethics committees over a number of years. It will work perfectly for an ethics committee. And we actually are already in the process of working with an ethics committee here in South Africa to pilot it with them. And the nice thing is, yes, it will work for both. We'll follow the same workflow. You'll set up a meeting. You assign the application to specific reviewers. They communicate back to the applicant. But the nice thing is they can now share the review or report after it's gone through ethics. They can share it with the regulator. And as more and more ethics committees and regulators start using platforms like this, we can definitely start sharing this. I think a data standardization is quite important so that we all follow sort of the same standard. So the average templates is sort of the standard when it comes to NRA applications. And I know there's a lot of work being done to standardize the way how ethics review applications are done. But yes, no, it can definitely work for a IRB or for a research ethics committee.
Thanks, Adrian. Really appreciate the answer for that. And I think this will be really important, particularly as the WHO and others are looking forward to streamlining regulatory ethics and processes. Now I'd like to invite all the panelists who will be joining us for the moderated panel discussion. If you could turn your videos on so everybody can see you. And I think a lot of their organizations and everything have already been mentioned in the previous conversations and presentations, but we're happy to have them with us today. And we're very thankful they're online and have the time to join us. So to start off, I'm going to ask everybody just to briefly introduce yourself. And I would like, after you've introduced yourself, I'd like to ask you to tell us what motivates you to be a part of strengthening the clinical trial landscape in Africa. And could we please start with Carolyn, followed by David? I think you're on mute, Carolyn.
Yes, sorry about that. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Caroline Masharia. I am a I'm a regional trial manager at Johnson & Johnson. And what motivates me is being able to see changes within the continent and more or less being that we cover 25% of the disease burden in Africa, wanting to see more clinical trials in the region. And thank you.
Thank you. David?
No, thank you very much. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to be part of this. David Mukanga is my name. I'm Deputy Director for Africa Regulatory Systems at the Gates Foundation, based out of the Nairobi office. So for the foundation, really, I think three things that motivate us to play in this space. One is the growing and clear global alignment around representation of all populations in clinical trials. So if this ecosystem is not well structured and efficient, that's not going to happen. So we want to enable the continent to be well represented in the data that is coming out of clinical trials. Secondly is acceleration of studies, time to decision, time to endpoint. That means, innovative products that can have impact get to patients faster. And then thirdly really is to help build a strong life science economy. If those clinical trials are not coming to the continent, Africa's best scientific talent will remain in Europe, in China, in North America. We want it to stay, want it to develop, so Africa has a strong life science economy. I would say those are the three things.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So I'd like to move on to Kate Monthly, followed by Kwasi.
Good evening, Janice, and thank you for the invitation to join. So I'm a family physician and bioethicist, and I've worked through all aspects of the clinical trial research process, from being a PI on clinical trials to serving on a research ethics committee, serving on DSMBs for the NIH, on the scientific advisory committee of EDCTP, and as a holder of 5 NIH grants. I have also conducted good clinical practice training for the past 2 decades. What motivates my interest in clinical trials in Africa is related in some respects to the work I did on research ethics committees as my PhD in 2004. And sadly, 2 decades later, many of the challenges that I wrote about then still exist in Africa. And my work over the past 2 decades in terms of capacity development on the continent in research ethics has made an impact. We've trained mid-career professionals in about 10 different African countries as a result of funding from the NIH for research ethics. And I know that EDCTP has done a huge amount of work in capacity development of research ethics committees and regulatory authorities on the continent. However, there are still so many challenges 2 decades later and still insufficient training that is occurring at the regulatory level. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about this later. But in order to improve clinical trials on the continent, we have a lot more work to do. And I'm also going to talk a little bit more about systems thinking, because I think many people are working in silos at the moment, and that is holding us back. Thank you.
Thank you. Kwasi?
Yes, thank you, Janice, for the opportunity to speak, and for the previous speakers for really setting an excellent background for this discussion, as well as actually all the answers that others have given. What motivates me probably is seeing how, in spite of all the setbacks, we are really beginning to move forward in some senses. It depends on really what you're looking for. And actually also realizing that this is going to take more than one group of people to do it, and really setting up the stage so that we can actually achieve results. I'm Kwesi Nyako with WHO, African Regional Office in Congo, Brazzaville. I'm the coordinator for something called AVREF, which was mentioned, which has been involved in capacity building for the last 20 years. And I'm happy to say that in the last 20 years, yes, we have seen significant changes, as has been mentioned. And there is still a lot of ways to go. But also within these 20 years, there has been significant changes in the environment as well, which definitely has a lot of things that can help us to go forward. But it also behooves us to really change our approach to ensure that we can take advantage of some of the things we have built to really see the results that actually, if I dare to say, that we deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, I'd like to invite Angelica and Elvis to introduce themselves, please.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Janice, for the invitation. So my name is Angelika Joos. I serve as Executive Director for Science and Regulatory Policy at MSD, and I'm also a member of the IFPMA Africa Regulatory Network. So what motivates me is really to contribute to the strengthening of the clinical trial landscape in Africa is because of this enormous untapped potential that the continent holds for global health. Africa represents 16% of the world's population, and it carries 25% of the global disease burden, and less than 4% of clinical trials are currently only taking place there. So with this growing and aging population and the unique genetic diversity that can inform the research and the development, I think Africa is really critical for advancing science and for ensuring that medicines work for everyone. We also hear that regulators increasingly expect diverse patient enrollment in all regions, actually, to guarantee more representativeness. And we need to build the capabilities now and the capacities now to position Africa as a key player in the next decade of this global health innovation. So for me, it's about equity, it's about scientific progress, and it's about preparing Africa for the future.
Thank you. Elvis?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Janice, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So I'm Elvis Temfak. I am the head of the R&D and Clinical Trial Coordination Mechanism within the Center for Science and Innovation at Africa CDC. So I would say that what really motivates me to work in optimizing the clinical trial ecosystem on the continent is that in my background, I've done quite a number of different types of studies where I've been PI on different really important studies on the continent. And even though most of those studies have brought out some really important information that led to change of some guidelines, it's still very painful to see that some of these products that come out of those trials are not accessible to the people. So having the opportunity to be leading this from the continental perspective, my major motivation is that we should come from the perspective of being priority-driven, impact-focused, and to ensure that we put in place systems that are going to fast-track us identifying problems and working to deliver sustainable products that can really get to the people whose problems we really want to solve through clinical research. So it's really a pleasure for me to be coordinating so many different pillars on this ecosystem, working with almost everyone who is on this panel today. So it's really a pleasure to see that these discussions, we're working in partnership to ensure that we really put in place these platforms to be able to solve some of the problems of the continent that may also be solutions to the global health space. So thank you very much for having me. That's it.
Thank you very much. And just a quick reminder to the audience, we will have an audience Q&A portion of this panel session. So please feel free to start typing some questions into the Q&A so we have some things lined up for our panelists. So I'm very happy to have our panelists with us today. I think even though maybe some of you do work together with each other, you are very complementary to each other. And I think some of the things that you mentioned about being priority driven or focusing on systems thinking and being aligned and helping to accelerate research and increase representation are really key and very important for us to remember as we have conversations around how we can strengthen the clinical research ecosystem in Africa. So to start, I would really like to focus a little bit on why streamlining clinical trial processes, particularly approvals, from both either an ethics and a regulatory perspective, is what seems to be such a hot topic right now. And what are the challenges in the current system that are driving this conversation? And I'd like to address this question to three people, if I may. I'd like to start with Kwazi, then go to Angelika, and then finish up with Elvis, if that's all right.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm just going to start by picking up a little bit on what has been presented. I mean, from Caxton's presentation, we can see the potential, we can see what has been done. And clearly, if processes are streamlined and harmonized, we can get fast results. So that's fairly obvious. And we've been talking about this, and this is sort of been on everybody's agenda for a while. But I think if we look deeper, we are going to see that, you have to first ask yourself, what is harmonization? And even in terms of reliance, what exactly are we looking at? And I think sometimes we address some of this at a surface level, and we keep talking about the same thing. We want harmonization, we want timely stuff, and at the end of the day, we are sometimes beginning to plateau on certain levels. So the potential definitely is there. Reliance is clearly very important that we need to do. But I think sometimes we also need to look at the context we have and how we can apply reliance. Reliance is it's not binary. It's not either yes or no. There is a spectrum of reliance. And I think in the process of doing this, we need to start calibrating sort of where this is at. But one of the main reasons to answer your question on why this is such a good topic, or it's on everybody's radar, is because I think increasingly we are all beginning to realize the potential that we are sitting on. Increasingly, particularly even looking at health sovereignty, vaccine manufacturing, pharmaceuticals manufacturing, addressing public health, access to all of this, I think gets into the issue of harmonization and reliance. And let's not forget that 20 years ago, when we wanted to look at capacity building, we started by focusing on the regulatory agencies as the bottleneck. Yes, a lot has been done, and actually we could see that you now have 9 countries that are ML3, you have a number coming. So the regulations start, but it doesn't end with regulation. And I think now that we are all beginning to see it and beginning to realize we need an ecosystem approach and actually requires all our involvement, this is part of why it's on everybody's sort of hot list. But also it requires that we find ways to work together to reliance, whatever way we define it. While there are definitions, we find ways to advance it, because the continent is quite heterogeneous. There is all sorts of different levels of regulators, who's doing what, different systems. And so when we talk about the continent as one continent, or one regulatory system and things like that, that's where sometimes I think we may fall short, and we really need to find a way to move this forward. I hope this answers it. And finally, when it comes to digitization, as you have seen from the presentation from Novotech, it's really a tool that was not there 20 years ago when we started, that can really help us to advance in all directions. But really, it is a tool. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Angelica, do you agree with what Kwasi is talking about, particularly looking at an ecosystem approach and that we need to get beyond the surface level of harmonization?
Yes, I fully agree with Kwasi. This is really, I think, key. I think what we really need, it's really streamlining these clinical trial processes, and specifically also the ethics and the regulatory approvals is really a hot topic, because the delays that we see directly impact currently patients' access to these innovative treatments. And today, the approvals involve a very fragmented system, lengthy timelines, duplicative reviews across multiple bodies, and that slows down the research. And it increases also the cost, with no obvious added benefit to safety of trial participants or the trustworthiness of results. And so at the same time, we also see that regulators and ethics committees face a growing complexity in the environment. There are more global trials that come to Africa. There are diverse patient enrollment requirements. There are advanced technologies like ATMPs or decentralized clinical trial elements that are used more and more. And so these challenges highlight really the need for more harmonization and efficiency and trust building to ensure that all these trials are timely and ethically sound, and without compromising the patient safety and data integrity, which is really core to the industry. So if we look at it more from a practical perspective, how can we do this? Because we should not only talk about strategy and theory, but really go down on practical issues. So how can we do implementation? And how can we reduce the duplication and aligning the requirements across ethics committees and regulatory authorities? And this means really concretely, for example, common application formats. So if we only have one format that we need to fill out as an industry, this saves time. We can submit faster applications to everyone. We also need to have fast and predictable review timelines, because then we can line up all the other elements that need to be in place to start the recruitment in the clinical trials, or the contracting, for example, with the hospitals or the site investigators. And so if it's predictable, we can much better plan. And so there's not so many hiccups. And then, of course, the reliance on the decisions, as Lara said, is really a key element that we think will help us. And also what we saw, the digital platforms, that's really a great opportunity. We can track the submissions, and we also need clear guidance there to minimize, of course, the ambiguity, and have clear guidance how to work with the systems and what to submit and everywhere. So it's really the goal to make the process more predictable and efficient, while we're also maintaining the high standards for patient safety and data integrity. And we want to have that the trials can start faster, we can do faster first patient enrollment, and that they can then be conducted and deliver the results, which ultimately is what we want, because that will benefit the patients globally.
Thank you, Angelica. And Elvis, your final thoughts on perhaps what you've heard from Kwasi and Angelica, plus your own perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So the first thing that you will notice when you do a mapping of capacity across the continent is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of available capacity. And we know very well that diseases don't respect boundaries. If we look at the number of outbreaks and public health emergencies that we have currently on the continent, we see that there is need for us to be able to work together to develop some of the solutions. And coming from a priority-based perspective, where we really strive to build capacity to develop end-to-end R&D, we realize that when we come from the ethics perspective, we get the approvals to be able to develop, to be able to generate the evidence that we need to be able to understand the problem at hand. And when this evidence is generated, this information needs to go also as well to the national regulatory agency, so that they know, especially within the very early phases of clinical trials, what are the safety profiles of the different countermeasures that we are putting in place. So doing the two in a way that we can do them in parallel instead of in series would help us to gain time. Secondly, when we look at the legislative landscape with respect to regulation, we see that it varies across so many countries. So talking about harmonization is already acknowledging the fact that something is happening in all the different member states. We bring the different stakeholders together to see what are the good practices that can make things go faster. We bring all of this together, and where there are the gaps, we come to a consensus on how do we bridge those gaps so that these processes can be streamlined. And that way we can define minimum requirements for both ethical review and also for regulatory review. And having this approach where we bring all the stakeholders together to come to that consensual level, we then come out with really easily followed approaches that we can develop on a platform, such that everyone knows that for me to be able to apply for ethical review for a specific type of study, these are the minimum requirements that the ethics committee will expect to see. When I'm doing for regulatory, this is what they expect to see. And that way we can be talking about harmonization. And if we bring the stakeholders together to co-develop those harmonized templates, then it can easily facilitate the process of relying on each other, because you know that the information that was provided to a regulatory agency that has relatively better capacity than yours, that gives either a positive or a negative feedback to that application, you can trust what they've done and you can count on that to also take your own decisions. So I think this is really something that is very timely, especially as in some emergency situations, we need to act with speed and efficiency, because that may be the only opportunity for us to generate the evidence that we need to be able to address the problem. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Elvis. Really appreciate the comments from you, Angelica and Kwazi, on outlining the challenges that you are seeing and perhaps the changes that have occurred over time. So one of the topics that you mentioned in this is the topic of ethics. And I think I would like to start there and just drill down a little bit. And Kaymonthi, you mentioned that you have experience as a principal investigator and you have had roles on regional ethics committees and institutional review boards. So from your perspective, what are the changes or improvements that you believe are most critical in the current ethics framework to enhance efficiency and integrity of the clinical trial processes?
Yeah. So, Janice, I think we have a whole host of regulations, guidelines. We have the WHO benchmarking tool. There has been so much development at the theoretical level. But I think the area where we experience challenges is implementation. And here, the continent is heterogeneous, and so every country is different. But in general, very few resources are allocated to regulatory authorities and research ethics committees. And so we're always complaining about delays in regulatory approval. But we have to look at the reality of, the volumes of work that go through to the committees, the difficulties they have with retaining members as research ethics committee members, because these are not remunerated roles. These are often roles played by busy academics in big institutions. Even private research ethics committees have, part-time people working on them. So I think to a large extent, we have severe resource constraints. And for funders, David, one of the funders, there are many other funders globally. But for many institutions that receive research funding, there is a specific percentage of the grant that is supposed to be allocated to indirect costs. And very rarely is this funding actually spent on research ethics committees and review processes. It gets spent on various other functions and places within institutions, but not where it ought to be spent. So research ethics committees in general on the continent require significant improvement in terms of the research funding that is allocated to them. And then, of course, capacity development. We've spoken a lot about the challenges with the ethics review process, but there is also quite a large responsibility that should rest with clinical trial researchers, CROs, the pharmaceutical industry, everybody who is actually submitting to that research ethics committee. Because in some instances, the reason for the delay is that submissions are inadequate. We shouldn't depend on a research ethics committee to tell us as investigators that our consent form is not appropriate, not adequately worded. If we ensure that all these measures are put in place before the submission goes through to ethics, it's going to be a much better, more streamlined process. A lot of the delays now result from a back and forth between the researchers or the clinical trial investigators and the research ethics committees. And so I think this is why I said earlier, systems thinking is so important, that across the board, levels of capacity development have to occur to improve the process overall. Caxton said something interesting: ethics must move at the speed of science. Scientists and researchers and clinical trial investigators likewise need to ensure that they are up to date in terms of what is required from a research ethics perspective. So it's not just about ticking a box and saying, oh, we will abide by the Declaration of Helsinki 2024. Do you actually know what's in the Declaration of Helsinki 2024? Do you have a a part of your protocol that states what your post-trial access arrangements are? Because that is a requirement of the Declaration of Helsinki. So if you haven't done that and you've submitted to a research ethics committee, you're going to get that question going back and forth until you answer it. And so this is an interdependent system. This is an ecosystem for clinical trials. And all members of that ecosystem, all the role players, need to play their role, need to play their part in expediting this process. With regard to regulatory reliance, I think that's a problem because of the gross variability in quality of review that occurs at different regulatory bodies. And this is what impacts negatively on building trust, is because one research ethics committee, even within the same country, does not trust the competency of another research ethics committee. And I'm going to give you experience from South Africa, where we have very, very well developed research ethics review systems with about 46 institutional research ethics committee, a national health research ethics council. And despite this fantastic infrastructure, reciprocal review is often a problem because recs don't trust each other in terms of competence. So I think a lot more work to be done in terms of, in order for there to be regulatory reliance, we need standardization. We need research ethics committee members to be certified. We need research ethics committees to be accredited. We need much larger, greater use of the WHO national benchmarking tool. I think these tools are there, but they are not being used across the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimantri. David, I was going to ask you about the use of the WHO benchmarking tool for ethics, but I think there's a lot in what Kimantri just shared with us that perhaps you'd like to comment on or pick up on, because I know that you're also focused on some work and some pilots in this strengthening ethics area.
No, absolutely. I think the colleagues here are raising very, very pertinent issues, and if we're going to get the continent to work together, you have to start at the national level. If the national level cannot work together, if two ethics review boards at two universities in neighboring states cannot trust each other, it's then difficult across countries. And that's why the work with the WHO around the global benchmarking tool for regulators and the ethics benchmarking tool for the ethics system are really, really critical. We see that on the regulatory side and how it has shifted the needle, that people now can say, okay, so if a regulator is at maturity level 2 or maturity level 3 or maturity level 4, this is their maturity level. We can understand what capabilities they have or don't have, and we can decide to rely on them or not. It's important that we see the same thing on the ethics side, and we're working with our colleagues within WHO to move that ethics benchmarking tool now towards the level where it can have those maturity levels, that those can be built in so that those assessments can happen. As you know, it's an ecosystem assessment which covers clinical research sites, it covers the governance side of things, so the ethics boards and so on. But the part on the ethics side is really important for it to evolve to that level, so that ethics boards can understand the different levels at which they are. And then certainly accreditation will go a long way to support that. But for me, the other piece that was important is the capacity of reviewers. And I think this, again, where these continental and global bodies can help with the elements around in-country capacity within ethics committees, within regulatory agencies, to provide these reviews. Because if you don't have capacity, that's part of the reason why reviews are delayed. You're trying to find a toxicologist, you're trying to find an epidemiologist, you're trying to find an expert depending on the disease area of the study. So and that's why collaboration then becomes important within country. Joint reviews within country where those are possible, joint reviews across countries, and the work that Kwazi and his team at Avaref are playing. The other piece that we see that's really, really important and that I haven't had anybody talk about is financing. I think those mentioned a little bit, around, people using indirect costs to support ethics committees, but institutions themselves, if they truly believe that this is human subject protection and they want to protect, governments, institutions should contribute there, but also a very well structured way in which a fee for service can be charged and creative incentives to motivate reviewers. So if you sit on an IRB, I used to be in academia many years ago. When you're given a protocol to review, it's voluntary, and your dean whips you to say, we are told you didn't meet the timeline. But if you review 30 protocols in 5 years, it doesn't count towards your promotion from lecturer to senior lecturer to associate professor, etc. But if you supervise a PhD student, that counts. So why can't review of, a huge vaccine trial, if you've been a reviewer there and played an important role, why shouldn't that contribute to your academic promotion? So those kind of creative elements also become important, because people are struggling in many of our countries between doing that review, finishing their academic assignments, marking exams, and finding school fees for their children. So you want your clinical trial to go above the school fees for the children? I'm not sure that's going to work. So there needs to be creative incentives for people to be able to commit time and be recognized for their good work in supporting reviews and so on. I think some of those practical elements, in addition to, the more fancy digitalization, et cetera, all of those things are good, but we need to recognize our reviewers. We need to recognize the good reviewers and incentivize them, in addition to building a solid, well-structured system, that then these reviews can go through. The final one I would add is, I think, trial sponsors need to share a little bit more in terms of, and bring visibility, and perhaps in partnership with patient advocates and others. What's the impact if you're rolling out a global clinical trial that is enrolling patients in North America and Europe, in Asia and Africa, and the sites in other geographies are moving forward, and Africa sites are delayed by 4 months to initiate patient enrollment? What does that mean for you as industry? What does that mean for patients? Ultimately, I think us being a little bit more crisp and clearer around the impact of some of these delays, I think will have a groundswell of impact on how people think about supporting, efficient review and decisions around when studies commence. Back to you, Janice.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot of good points that both you and Kimanthi have shared, but I would like to actually pick up on the point that you mentioned about the capacity and capability of reviewers, because I think that's a good segue to ask a question of Kwasi and talk a little bit more about what he's doing at AVRF with the pilots to help build regulatory capacity and capability. Kwasi, would you like to just share a little bit more there for us, please?
Thank you very much. And then thank you, David, for your last point. I think as we delve deeper, some of the issues such as what David mentioned about sustainability, financing, promotion, all these things, we really have to look at it to be able to move forward. Now, when it comes to capacity, one of what AVRF is doing in terms of our root cause analysis really had to deal with capacity. And it's capacity, not general capacity, but really defined in terms of expertise, in terms of practice in implementing, and sort of the ability to deal with some of these complex things or complex reviews based on possibly even exposure. Let me use a simple example in soccer. People are born, soccer players have natural capacity they are born with. Africa folks are good. And now you have a lot of African players playing in the European League. But think about a player who is good, was in Africa, hasn't been exposed to the European League. Their level of play, the level of coaching they have, all these things would be different just based on the exposure. It's not about competence, it's not about expertise, but it's about exposure. Because we have low volume of clinical trials, even our good folks don't get enough exposure. Now, what's AVRF doing? Part of what we began to do with our pilot was taking a look at all these issues that we've talked about, all these, call them irritants or bottlenecks or challenges. How do we solve them together using this ecosystem approach? So we have a number of countries, currently 16 countries that got together that actually want to solve this together. What did they do? Countries have provided 3 reviewers each. So we have a pool of 48 reviewers. So all of a sudden, finding different experts, finding your toxicologist, finding your neurologist or whatever, it's not different because now they are willing to share. They're willing to share not only the work, but the expertise. They are willing to be trained together. They are willing to build trust together. They're willing to work and share. And this is part of the process by which we are going. So in the process of working on this pilot, we're beginning to see that whenever we have a submission, we are able to find the skill set that we need. For example, we needed information on adaptive design. We got EMA to train the 48 on adaptive design. So in the process of actually adapting to the real world situation, dealing with the problems that we have or the challenges, we're beginning to find a pathway forward. We're beginning to actually work in record time. We're beginning to find the reviewers that we need going forward. And this is really an example of how we are dealing with challenges that we face with real problems and real solutions, in a sense that we are calibrating our capabilities with the, with the realities of it. And in addition to that, we have found coaches and mentors for this group, and I think it's beginning to work. And so this is an example of part of what our pilot is about, which is being supported by, David's group, by Gates, by Wellcome Trust, by others. And gradually we're beginning to go forward and actually beginning to share and see the results. So if this gives an example, but instead of trying to build capacity for just one country, we are really building a capacity together. The group has been divided into their various expertise. They are working together. They are getting to know each other. That talks about the trusting. And yes, we actually, when they do reviews, we actually give them a little bit of a stipend, courtesy of, Gates Foundation and others. So this is practically dealing with this and leveraging something like this in terms of the regulatory aspect. We are adding on the ethics, and we will be working with researchers and all that, so that at the end of the day, from the ecosystem, we will be able to say we have countries that have the capacity, we have countries that actually are willing to work together, so that if, in true sense, if you have a submission in country A and it involves, country B, because they are part of the network, it's easy for them to accept, and it's easy for them to deal with their sovereignty issues, and we are finding practical ways of making this forward. And that's an example of what we are doing. I hope it sheds a bit of light in where we are. Thank you.
It certainly does. And, I really do applaud the concept that you have of, working on a pilot with 16 member states rather than just one particular country, because I think that gets back to what Kimantri said earlier about that systems thinking and that building trust. And really looking at how we're not hopefully operating in silos. So I have a question for Elvis and then Carolyn. I haven't forgotten about either one of you. And then I think we'll move to the audience Q&A. But Elvis, so you've heard about all of this capacity and capability building, the perspectives from David and Kimantri and others on, what are some things that we could do to potentially make implementation easier and better. So when you hear all of this, and knowing that you have a memorandum of understanding with the Global Health EDCTP3, how are you leveraging these perspectives, and how are you potentially taking this forward when we talk about improving coordination and streamlining regulatory and ethics review?
Thank you very much, Janice. So I would start by commenting on one of the things that was mentioned by Kimantri about we have quite a number of frameworks and documents that have been developed, but there is an issue about implementation as well as monitoring and evaluation to see where we are. I would say that the Memorandum of Understanding that we signed with EDCTP earlier this year It's one of those streamlined partnership documents that we are signing with other partners to make sure that we leverage each other's capacity and the work that each and everyone is doing to be able to strengthen this clinical trial ecosystem. As I mentioned, our approach is we really want to do end-to-end R&D, where we start by identifying the priority problems that we have on the continent, and then we identify where the capacity is and how and what are the specific gaps in these capacities where we can come in to really support. So I'll take a step back to say that this MOU that we signed with EDCTP is actually a continuation of the work that started some years earlier. Sometime in May 2020, I think it was in May 2023, we had this come together that involved really many different stakeholders, including Science for Africa Foundation, the Gates Foundation, WHO, EDCTP, and even industry, as well as other key players within this space. And we said for us to be able to be pragmatic in the way we improve the clinical trial ecosystem, we need to identify key pillars that need strengthening. And these key pillars did not mean that we ignore the work that is ongoing, but these were identified as really areas that if we make some strides in improving them, then we can really move from one significant step to the other. So with this now, Africa CDC developed this roadmap for the strengthening of the clinical research ecosystem, because I prefer to call it clinical research ecosystem, to include other types of studies that are ongoing. And at the time when we had that initial come together, there were some other partners who were not there, but who actually liked the idea and they have joined and they are supporting. And I would say that from the continental perspective where we sit, we are really very transparent to say this partner is supporting this particular pillar, this partner is supporting the other one, this is where we have gaps to be able to move this forward. And within this pillar, one of the key things is starting to say, how do we first of all identify the priorities for which we need to do clinical research? And currently, I am in Burundi to support the national stakeholders to set the national research priorities. We are already doing this activity in 30, we are already at 30 countries now with the objective of doing 40 by the end of this year. And then alongside this process, where we are setting the national health research priorities using the same methodology, because we want to be able to aggregate national priorities to identify regional priorities as well as continental priorities. We developed a tool to access available capacity from discovery science through preclinical studies along all the different phases of clinical trials, to be able to know where the capacity is, where the gaps are. And I can assure you that the initial findings show that the area of this spectrum that we always call the valley of death is where we really need to put in a lot of effort. Then one of the pillars is ethics and regulation. And we are doing a lot of work in collaboration with AUD and NEPAD. I forgot to mention that AUD and NEPAD was one of the key players in that space when we had that initial come together to look at the ethics component. And this is in collaboration also with AVAREF, because when you look at the work that AMRH and now AMA has done, there has been a lot of concentration within the regulatory space. But if you look at the ethics one, there's still a lot of work to be done there. So this is also one of the key things that we need to do to come together to say, what are the different initiatives that are ongoing? Who is doing what? How do we complement each other? And this can only be done if we are very transparent. Another key component of these pillars is that of community and public engagement, which we need to really understand what does it mean, the people who are participating in the study. How does a minister or a politician understand what we want to do? Because I can assure you, research is one of the areas within the health space which is neglected. But at the same time, research is like the kitchen where all the cooking has to happen to provide what we need to be able to solve the problems. Now, last but not least, leveraging digital technology. And I'm really glad to say that we are really working with Adrian's team to look at how does this data that we collect on the capacity on the continent, how do we put it in a platform such that for us to be able to know where the priorities are, and we want to do research in those spaces, what are the institutions that have the capacity? Who are the researchers that are there? How do we contact them? How do we get researchers to work with each other? I think David mentioned something to say for industry. What would it mean to you to be able to have a clinical trial where you have representation from all religions of the world? If we can be able to build that platform where you can initiate all of those and then we go at the same speed, then I think we will really go a long way to be able uh, to improve that. And also to say that when you look at the global um, action points for clinical trial optimization that was launched by WHO, these are some of the discussions which actually were part of that initial meeting, and Africa CDC is a key stakeholder within these global action points. And so these pillars, they really are complementary with what WHO is doing. So what we need to really do here is come together and ask, what does each and every one of us has as capacity? How do we leverage each other? How do we work in a very transparent way to avoid a situation where you go to a member state and you mention something and everyone is telling you, why is everyone coming to tell me about the same thing? How do we leverage to be able to address, to come to the same stakeholders with one objective, one approach, such that by the time we put all of that effort together, we can actually measure the impact of what we are doing. I think with this, I'm going to stop here to say, Africa CDC, we believe very strongly in partnership, and we are very open and transparent to work with all those who are ready to support that space. Thank you very much, and back to you, Janice.
Thank you, Elvis. And it's been very comprehensive response, but I'd like to pick up on that partnership thing because I think that's a good segue to Carolyn, what you're doing with the Clinical Trials Community Africa Network, the CTCAN, right? You are looking at a sustainable umbrella network of clinical trial sites. And I think partnering with national regulatory authorities and ethics committees is probably important to the success of CTCAN. So can you share a little bit more about that with us?
Sure. Thank you very much for that. And just as a note, in 2025, Access to Medicine recognized the collaboration of CTCAN and pharmaceutical industry as a remarkable step. And as a segue to that, the initial phase of our work at CTCAN involved close collaboration with consortium members, which included incorporation of industry partners to develop a comprehensive framework for capturing regulatory, ethics, and operational requirements essential for clinical trials within Africa. And the framework was built by more or less mapping existing tools, and comparative analysis of these resources was done around thematic areas, which included health authority requirements for initiating clinical trials, premature termination requirements for clinical trials, end of trial requirements, as well as ethics committee processes inclusive of inter-country joint reviews, and also procedures on importation, distribution, exportation of investigational medical products, and also biological materials. The framework underwent an internal review by the members of the work plan, as well as representatives of the EDCTP networks of excellence. And the process of review included creating workflows, process flow maps, as well as AI integration of the various health authority requirements that were gathered from the exercise. And with that, the work group was then able to contact various ethics and health authorities and were able to gather data from about 39. There were 39 ethic committees across 13 countries. As well as they were able to collect data from 9 health authorities across Africa, covering both East, West, Central Africa, and also the Southern African region. And once the data was collected, the work plan also worked to review the capacity gaps illustrated or found through the data collected. And then it's also worth noting that we were able to actively collect, we're actually actively collecting more data throughout the ongoing survey. And one of our intentions is to be able to publish this in 2026 and also to be able to help in promoting capacity strengthening initiatives. With the promotion of the utilization of digital tools for clinical trial applications and approvals, has also been integrated into the model, and also the CTC platform that Adrian spoke about earlier. And this has been incorporated with a couple of national regulators in Tanzania, Nigeria, and South Africa, and with the hope to expand the CTC platform to other countries. And this link allows for access to digital applications and approvals, which assist in accessibility to regulatory platforms for regulatory authorities and also for industry. And that's about it for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I think it's really important that, we look at how a comprehensive review of everything can help identify the gaps, as you mentioned, and promote capacity building and use of tools. Just real quickly, I'd like to go to one or two questions. We have a question here from WHO talking about the solidarity trial and the challenges with enrolling significant numbers in Africa due to the inability of national authorities to approve the protocol within a reasonable time frame. Has this been addressed now, or what is a reasonable time frame to address the problem that this highlights? Who would like to maybe try to answer that question? Or if not answer it directly, maybe indirectly, if you're like to try that one. Any thoughts? Kwasi, I'm going to put you on the spot on this one, I think.
Sure. Yeah. What I would say is that the AVRF process for joint review is a process that is available, where we are able to quickly bring together the national regulatory agencies and the ethics committees to make a decision. And I believe we were part of the solidarity trial. The issue is when it comes to the AVRF process, yes, we are able to make the decision if it's urgent within 15 days or typically in a 30-day time frame or 60 days, which we rarely do. But because AVRF is not a regulatory agency, we make the decisions jointly with the NRAs, but they still go to their countries and get the decision made. And it is that which sometimes gets, some of the challenges that we have. But with regard to the pilot that I did mention, we're not fully implemented yet, but the pilot, a condition for the pilot was that the countries were going to accept the decision and actually make the decision within the published timeframes, and that if the decision was not made, they were going to be penalized, and all these countries agreed to do that. So there is a willingness for this to happen. There's a willingness for countries to work together. But importantly, as has been said, a lot of the reasons why sometimes I think these applications do take time has to do with expertise, has to do with the people doing the submissions. And I believe that if we beef up on the capacities and we are able to get that really under control, it will impact the timelines, and we'll be able to see that. And we are in the process of doing that. We are beginning to see that, providing the right support, working with folks. I think, trying to, maybe pressure folks to, sign on to reliance agreements and things like that. That's not the only solution. And I don't think that typically works. As was mentioned, every regulatory agency has a national responsibility to make sure that they are approving the trial that they understand. And very few countries, I believe, if probably not in an emergency, are going to approve something they don't understand just by saying that because of reliance, they are doing that. I don't think any politician would like to hear that. And so we need to find ways in which we can actually not only do reliance, but really put in the necessary capacity building that's required and facilitate working together to achieve what I would consider to be real timely results. I hope this sheds some light on it. But yes, as has been mentioned, the systems are not perfect, and definitely there are some things that could go faster than it is right now. Thank you.
So
Okay,
maybe
thank you.
if I can
Yes,
just
please.
jump in to provide some a point of view on that. And I'll build on what Kwasi has just said about using a punitive approach when people don't abide to consensus. I think I would come from a different angle to say that we need to really ensure that our stakeholder engagement is such that people really buy into the idea and they really understand what is in that protocol. Kemati mentioned the fact that there is also a responsibility from the side of the researchers, where the researcher need to agree to know what is expected of them from the regulatory agencies, and not just write a protocol that is full of the science part and you complaining that they don't get the feedback. They need to be trained to know what should they provide to these regulatory agencies, and to give some information to highlight a little bit on the question that Vazi asked. I would like to know whether when these solidarity trials were designed, who were the key stakeholders? Were they national stakeholders in the countries who were part of the drafting of those protocols, where they could actually shed light to their national regulatory agencies to say this is something that is quite important? Because one of the things that we notice when we go to our member states is that the vertical approach is no more working. If you have an idea from the top, please bring the stakeholders together and build that idea and meet somewhere in the middle where you come to a consensus to really understand what has to be done. Because the same way you may see something as a priority may not be the same as the member state will see it as a priority. So this consensual building, this stakeholder engagement, and that's one of the reasons why I was saying that one of the pillars of this ecosystem should be really clear approaches to how do we involve different stakeholders at different levels. Because I'm sure that if at the national level, the rightful authorities don't see their interest in that work, I don't think the ethics committee is even going to have a look at that. So that will be my contribution from this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think all of you know Vasi, so if you have further questions about his question, let you follow up with him offline. I just want to wrap up right now, but I want to say a big thank you to all of you as panelists. I think the different perspectives that you've brought have been really enriching, and I think it's been a really good opportunity to have you with us today, and just want to say a big thank you. So I will now hand over to my colleague, Saba, who is going to share some key takeaways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, everyone, for an insightful and engaging session today. As we conclude our 4-part webinar series, which has spanned the past 3 months, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to all our presenters, speakers, and panelists who have contributed to the Africa Regulatory Conference 2025 edition. This year, we focused on the theme of strengthening the clinical trial ecosystem in Africa, with the aim of raising awareness, providing insights, and identifying key actions central to the topic. Throughout the series, we explored a range of important areas where Webinar 1 highlighted the patient and community engagement in clinical trials and emphasized the need to design with patients at heart alongside collaborative approaches. Webinar 2 addressed underrepresented populations, underscoring the importance of inclusivity in research. Webinar 3 showcased innovative clinical trial designs and digital technologies, featuring case studies and tools driving innovation. And today's Webinar 4 focused on regulatory and ethics approvals, examining strategies to harmonize, simplify, and accelerate processes across the continent. And just to highlight some statistics, we had over 1,200 total registrants, with 66% attending the conference. Furthermore, we had a diverse audience joining us from across the globe, with 70% of participants coming from Africa, 22% from Europe, 8% from Asia, and 2% from South America. Looking ahead, for the next iteration of the Africa Regulatory Conference in 2 years' time, we aim to continue bringing you exciting and relevant topics and encourage you to share any ideas or suggestions for future discussions. On behalf of IFPMA, I would like to say thank you again for joining us today. We also encourage you to visit our website to access the recordings of all the sessions, as well as to fill out a quick participant survey popping out on your screens right now. And finally, I'm also happy to announce our next Asia Regulatory Conference, which we will be hosting next year. Thank you once again, and we wish you a wonderful day.